Welcome back to the illumilands. My name is Daniel Hurd, and in this video, I'll be going over my most ambitious project yet. It's not an overstatement to say that the things in this video apply to literally everything. And when I say everything, I mean literally everything, from books to emotions to physical objects, to time, to anything. Literary interpretation, this applies. It's not an overstatement to say that the things in this video will apply to every area ever. This is the first video in a series of videos that I want to do focusing on dimensions. All of us are familiar with the 3 dimensions of space, length, width, and depth, but not many people extend their dimensional thinking beyond the 3rd or 4th dimension. Usually when we talk about higher dimensions, we're talking on the same level as if we were talking of superpowers. They're cool to think about, and we can really analyze, what would it be like for someone with super strength or the ability of flight to live in the world. But at the end of the day, we know that superpowers and beings with superpowers aren't real. We're just making them up. We're talking about imaginary stuff. I personally think there's a good case to be made that these higher dimensions we'll be discussing actually might exist. But even if they don't exist, what this provides, this talk about dimensions, is a way of thinking about reality. Before I get into the video, a reminder that if you like it, click the like button, and if you really like it, hit the subscribe button so that you can keep up with my newest videos. Also, if you really enjoy what I do and you find a lot of value in it, consider donating to my Patreon. Link is in the description. I should also say, before starting the video, that I have an immense level of gratitude to a man by the name Rob Bryanton. He inspired me, really, to start thinking dimensionally. He has a phenomenal video. I believe the name of it is 10 Dimensions Explained. He is a fantastic thinker, and I highly recommend you check that video out. Without further ado, let's begin to think dimensionally. In starting our discussion, we aren't starting with the first dimension. No, that would actually be skipping something very important, which is the so-called 0th dimension. And what is the 0th dimension? What is 0D? To be a 0D object is merely to be information. It is to be unspecified, something that's real or true, but that's not represented in any observation. If that sounds incredibly confusing already, that is A-okay. In fact, it'd be weird if you weren't confused. As we'll see, this 0th dimension is actually an unobserved version of the 10th dimension. If you're watching this and you're already familiar with dimensions, you might be smirking because technically I just gave away the end of where this is all going. I gave away the end point, so to speak. When all is said and done and our thinking about dimensions is completely full, completely satisfied, we'll find that that all-encompassing dimension of dimensions just is this 0th dimension. Now that I've blown your mind just a little bit, we can get into what is admittedly the simplest part of our discussion. which is the 0th dimension. Because even though what I've just said is incredibly weird and seemingly complicated, the 0th dimension is really just one point. It's a single point. Imagine a perfect point. The dot you see on the screen represents a point, but in all fairness, it's not a perfect point because you can see it. That means it's at least a 1D or 2D object. A perfectly 0D point would be invisible. As Rob Bryanton puts it, quote, a 0D point merely indicates a position in a system. Say we have another point in a different location. What's the shortest distance between 2 points? A straight line. And thus, we're already in the 1st dimension. See, that wasn't too hard. We can now identify different points along the line and describe their unique relations to every other point. But what if, starting from one point, we want a different progression, so we aren't limited to going back and forth on this one line? But the only way to achieve this is to presuppose a higher dimension capable of housing multiple intersecting lines. Thus, we arrive at the 2nd dimension. Wow, going by pretty fast. Instead of limiting ourselves to one set progression of points, we now have different progressions and points not contained on the original line. We also have brand new lines relating our original starting point to our original end point, with each new line being longer and richer than the original line. But what if this isn't enough for us? We don't only want different and longer ways to travel between points. We want instantaneous travel between distant points. The scenic route is nice. It's nice to have all these different ways to get from A to B. But we're in a hurry. Can instantaneous travel across points be achieved? Is teleportation possible? Put another way, can there be a shorter distance between A and B than our already straight line? Yes, but as Rob Bryanton points out, this is only possible if there is another dimension through which we can fold our 2D plane to have A and B touch. Thus, we arrive at the 3rd dimension, the one we all know and love. With 1D, we have length. With 2D, we have length and width combined. And with 3D, we have length, width, and depth combined. 3D beings, like ourselves, are not confined to a particular plane, but can cross between planes. This means we have the added space, no pun intended, to fold A and B so they touch. For a 2D being on our now folded plane, magic appears possible. It's possible to teleport instantly from A to B without going through any points in between. The shortest distance between 2 points is apparently not a straight line. But from a 3D perspective, nothing strange or unintuitive is happening. The only reason our 3D being seems to teleport is that whereas A and B are separated in the 2nd dimension, they are right next to each other in the 3rd dimension. It's not that the straight line principle is violated. The 3D being just has more lines available to it than the 2D being. And some of these lines have A and B next to each other. there are special connections between A and B that only 3D beings can access. Now that we've completed the journey from 0D to 3D objects, we can discuss what is called the Point-Line-Plane Postulate. For all intents and purposes, the Point-Line-Plane Postulate says that the same 3 steps we just took to shift from 0D to 3D can be used to describe the shift from any dimension to any other dimension. Let me repeat that. The same 3 steps we just took to get from 0D all the way to 3D can be used to describe the shift from any dimension to any other dimension. We have a point. The first step is to connect the point to a new point with a line, and this line is our first dimension. The second step is to connect a point on our original line with a new point not on our line. This new line is traveling along our second dimension, which means we're actually dealing with a flat plane of some sort. The third and final step is to connect a point on our plane with a point not on our plane. This new line is traveling along our third dimension, which means we're dealing with a space. The Point-Line-Plane Postulate states, or rather assumes, that we can treat an entire space as a point in its own right. In this way, we can repeat the steps over and over and see from our limited 3D point of view what higher dimensions might be like. Even if you're skeptical of the Point-Line-Plane Postulate, assume it's true for the sake of argument. You might be surprised how much intuitive sense it makes of higher dimensions. The Point-Line-Plane Postulate says we can treat entire spaces as points. In going from 0D, a point, to 1D, a line, we connected our starting point to a different point. To go from 3D to 4D, then, we need to imagine our original space being connected to a different space. The Point-Line-Plane Postulate implies that just as a line is made of points, this 4D space line is made of space points. Points that are themselves spaces. Not points in space, points of space. Points made out of space. Our original space is an example of a space point. If this talk of space points and space lines seems odd, there's an easier, though slightly misleading way of talking about the fourth dimension. Replace space point with moment and space line with timeline. What we're really talking about when we discuss the fourth dimension is a progression, a timeline from one moment to another moment. The path from my birth to the present is an example of one such timeline. The reason this talk is misleading is that we often think of time not just as a progression, but as a lived or experienced progression. After all, every dimension we've gone over has involved some kind of progression, where members here are different than members there. But it's the subjective lived experience that most of us associate with time. And this subjective quality is not part of the fourth dimension, or any particular dimension for that matter. It's more accurate to call points in the fourth dimension the things we experience, not the experiences themselves. It is thus helpful to distinguish between a 4D object, which can accurately be labeled a timeline, and our subjective experience of traveling the points on a timeline. A 3D moment is not an observation, and a 4D timeline is not a string of observations. The 3D moment and 4D timeline are the things that are observed. As long as we keep this distinction in mind, there's nothing wrong in speaking of the third and fourth dimensions as moments and timelines. A 4D timeline is a set progression from one moment to another. An observer with complete 4D control would be able to travel in the reverse direction of time, like in the movie Tenet. Additionally, they could experience events at faster and slower speeds, in the same way we humans can change the speed of our spatial movements. Just as we can change our length, width, and depth, a perfect 4D being could change its direction in time as well. But this is only one timeline, so no matter how you manipulated it, you could only ever experience the same progression of events over and over again. What if we wanted to see, for better and worse, other ways our lives could have been? This would involve points and lines not contained on our actual timeline, requiring us to move into the next dimension, the fifth dimension. If 4D beings can rightly be called timelines, 5D beings can rightly be called timeplanes. Think back to Scrooge in A Christmas Carol. Scrooge sees the terrible result of his life's current trajectory and resolves to become a better person. We can rethink Scrooge's experience in the following way. Scrooge is seeing the 4D timeline where he never makes any character improvements and continues in his greed, and he desires to take a different trajectory. There is no better example of the difference between the fourth and fifth dimensions than this slightly edited version of Scrooge's question to the spirit of Christmas yet to come. Are these the signs of things that will be, or things that may be only? If I depart from my ways, can they change? Thankfully for Scrooge, what we did with lines in the second dimension can be done with timelines in the fifth dimension. Scrooge has the freedom to walk toward alternate versions of his future self, and he wishes to observe the reality where he learns his lesson and changes for the better. Notice what I said. Scrooge has the freedom to make this change. This connection to freedom leads many, including myself, to think that what we call free will is, or at least involves, control over 5D reality. Again, 5D reality involves branching out from a 4D timeline into a plane of multiple intersecting timelines, different possible ways for the same space, the same moment to progress. So to have control over 5D reality is to have some control over the way a 3D object, like me or you, progresses. That sounds a heck of a lot like free will. But I don't want to go off on a free will tangent, so let's move on. Instead of limiting ourselves to one set progression of events, one timeline, we can go to events not contained in our original timeline. We also have all new, unique timelines relating event A to event B. And each new timeline is longer and richer than the original. But what if this isn't enough for us? We want the time travel of science fiction, instantaneous travel between different events in our timeline. We want to witness the fall of Rome, the American Revolution, and most importantly, the 25-point Patriots Super Bowl comeback against the Falcons. How can this be done? By going to the next dimension, of course. You'll recall how a 3D being can teleport between points on a line without going through any points in between. The Point-Line-Plane Postulate says that something fundamentally true of the first three dimensions, lines, planes, and spaces, is true of the next three dimensions, what I'm calling timelines, timeplanes, and timespaces. And remember to keep in mind the distinction between subjective and objective time. In discussing the fourth, fifth, and sixth dimensions, we're discussing objective time. But in discussing our experience of these dimensions, we are discussing subjective time. If our 5D time plane is on a 6D time space, we have the extra space to bend our 5D time plane and bridge distant events. Imagine a man, Mr. 6D, introduces himself to you and claims to have time-traveling abilities. To prove himself, he tells you to meet him at this same location in 20 years. Suddenly, Mr. 6D vanishes. No sound, just an instant absence. Exactly 20 years have passed, and your physical appearance shows it. You've had 2 more decades of life experience. Physically and mentally, you've grown and become a different person. You go exactly where you were 20 years ago and wait. After a short while, Mr. 6D suddenly appears in front of you, identical to himself 20 years ago, down to the last detail. You're stunned and might even be tempted to treat him like an odd acquaintance you haven't seen for decades. But to Mr. 6D, he's still introducing himself and has swiftly proven his time-traveling abilities. Everything around you changed, but he used the 6th dimension to bypass this change. A being with total 6D control could travel instantly between any events on any 4D timeline within the 6D object of which it's a part. And again, from a 6D perspective, nothing strange or unintuitive is happening. The only reason Mr. 6D can seemingly time travel is that whereas events A and B are separated in the 4th dimension, they are right next to each other in the 6th. He literally has more timelines available than we do, and some of them have events A and B right next to each other. But wait, you might say, this only shows time travel from the present to the future. Events like the fall of Rome, the American Revolution, and the 25-point Super Bowl comeback are all in the past. Can Mr. 6D travel to the past? This is an excellent question, and the short answer is yes, because Mr. 6D has total 6D control. But the longer answer is that the question itself arises because of a failure to distinguish between vectored and non-vectored beings. Without getting too far into the weeds, a vector is something with both an inherent size and direction. as opposed to something with only inherent size and no direction. So, if there's a dimension where a being is vectored, that means the being lacks control over their direction and speed in that dimension. Examples include non-sentient objects in the third dimension and humans incapable of changing the pace at which they experience new moments. If a being is non-vectored, that being has the freedom to control their direction and speed in a dimension. Examples include Mr. 6D in the sixth dimension and humans in the third dimension. This distinction, though not crucial for the purposes of this video, is just one more way of describing higher dimensions in terms that can describe all dimensions. But at this point, it's enough to know that 6D reality describes the set of all possible timelines stemming from one space, one moment. And this is incredibly similar to the definition of 3D reality, all possible lines stemming from one unified point. I think it's fair to say that if we don't know what a particular dimension is like, then we really can't bridge that to a higher dimension. In other words, we need to go one dimension at a time. We can't necessarily describe 9D reality without first describing 4D reality. Each higher dimension presupposes all the other dimensions. This discussion going from 0D to 6D reality is really just the primer that's necessary for our discussion in another video starting at the 7th dimension. And with that, we come to the end of the video. Thank you all so much for giving this a view and sticking with it to the end. I know it's very heady stuff, but I find it fascinating, and I think it's actually important and helpful for thinking about all aspects of our lives. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content, and consider donating to my Patreon. While enlightening and entertaining, making these videos is not free. So your financial support is extremely appreciated and even necessary. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you in another video.